The storm hasn't let up for 2 days. Searchers slog through waist-high brush, their lights scattering against sleet, radios crackling with fragments of words lost to static. 100 men are stretched thin across Larch Mountain, calling for a 16-year-old who vanished without boots or a coat. Somewhere below, his father waits in silence, replaying the moment he left his son beneath a tree and returned to find him gone. Then, up on a ridge, a team halts. Behind a moss-covered boulder, something lies motionless in the snow. For a long second, no one speaks. The radios hiss. The storm presses in. And when the call finally breaks through the static, nothing on the mountain will feel the same again. Welcome to the Shelldrake Files. Three days earlier, this was supposed to be a simple winter hunt. James McCormick Jr, 16, had driven east with his father, James Sr, a Portland Fire Bureau lieutenant who knew the Gorge Hills and took pride in doing things by the book. They parked near the seasonal snow gate below Larch Mountain and moved upslope with their hound, intending to hunt for the day and drop back before dark. Larch Mountain isn't a single peak so much as a weather machine. Steep gullies, sudden cliffs, and dense evergreen that turn distances into guesswork the moment conditions shift. By mid-afternoon, the conditions did shift. Rime glazed the trail. Rain began, then thickened into a wet snow. Visibility collapsed. What had looked like straightforward country on a map turned into a maze of slick rock, false paths, and sound that didn't travel more than a few trees. As evening closed, father and son took shelter under heavy branches and waited for daylight, cold, hungry, and burning through the energy they need tomorrow. Morning did not reward them. The wind came harder. Snow had crusted, making every step a fight. James Jr., big and strong, began to fade in a way that made no sense for a kid who could normally gut out a bad day. Slower steps, muddled responses, that heavy, unfocused look people get when the cold starts making decisions for them. James Sr. tried to carry him in bursts, half drags, half piggyback, through knee-deep brush and over icy roots. After hours of that, still trapped in a featureless, gray-green room of trees and storm, something flickered in the distance. Light, white and steady, exactly like headlights where no road should be. The father settled his son on a sheltered nook and moved toward the glow to find a landmark or help. Branches whipped, the light shifted behind trunks, and then it was gone. Trees, snow, and the quiet hiss of sleet. He doubled back fast. The nook was empty. He called, circled, widened his search, listened for any answer. Nothing carried. After a long, grinding stretch of searching alone, one door remained. Get off the mountain, raise an alarm, and send the largest possible search back into the storm. Late the next morning, soaked to the bone and unsteady, James Sr. reached Multnomah Falls Lodge. He hadn't eaten since Saturday. He was shaking, barely upright, but lucid enough to lay out a startling picture. Where they'd parked, where they'd hunted, where he thought he'd left the boy, and where that strange light had appeared. The first wave assembled quickly. Deputies, rangers, off-duty firefighters who recognized the name McCormick and didn't need a second call, and volunteer teams who lived for these moments. Dog teams came in. A few fixed-wing passes were attempted when the ceiling lifted, but rotorcraft weren't in play for that weather. The core plan was textbook. grid the likely area from high to low, work drainages and benches methodically, and keep the father close to maps while keeping him off the line to recover. The terrain immediately fought back. Under a thin skin of new snow, the ground was a trap of slick roots and brush that grabbed at clothing. Sleep blew sideways on the ridges. In the trees, fog made the world small. Even voices felt shortened. 10 yards, 20 yards, then swallowed. Searchers pounded in colored ribbons to mark their lanes and set check-in times so nobody disappeared into the same confusion that had taken the boy. Mid-afternoon delivered the first clues. A small personal item, then a sock. A little farther on, the other sock, and then the boots. Searchers hate that pattern. Heavy cold and confusion can make people shed layers they desperately need, a behavior that defies logic to anyone who's warm and fed, and makes terrible sense to minds sliding into hypothermia. The finds told a hard truth. The boy was moving in worsening shape, and he was now barefoot in winter timber. Night fell and the line didn't break. Headlamps moved as a loose constellation across the slope. From below, you could look up into the dark and trace the grid by drifting pinpricks of light. Radios filled with short, clipped reports. Negative here, possible impression there, wind erasing everything. The father stayed quiet in a corner of the base area, wrapped in a borrowed coat, eyes on the doorway where teams stepped in and out like waves. Before dawn, more help arrived. Explorer scouts from Salem with trained leaders, additional volunteers, more off-duty firefighters who could navigate brush by feel. The search boss tightened the grid and extended it west along Franklin Ridge and toward Franklin Cliff, a sharp, hazardous lip above the gorge. Strategy shifted to a slower crawl. Take fewer steps, scan more inches, call out every irregularity. Dog teams tried again, but scent was shredded by wet wind and cold, the air refusing to hold a trail. Oddities piled up in small ways. A line would pass a pocket of trees, then another line would pass the same pocket from a different angle and swear it looked untouched. In one gully, footprints that might have been impressions melted into slush within minutes. A firefighter ran fingers along a cedar trunk and felt heat in his hands, not from the wood, but from his own skin numbed enough to misread temperature. None of these details are supernatural. All of them make the world feel tilted when you're already tired. Late morning slid into afternoon. The scouts were assigned to push a section along the west side of Franklin Ridge where brush grew thick around waist height and boulders broke the slope into blind corners. Up and down the line, you could hear that thin edge in people's voices, the math of time and exposure closing in. Through all of this, something kept gnawing at the teams. For an unbooted teenager in winter conditions, found items behind, the window for survival was tight. Given the number of searchers, the dogs, the air checks, the tight grid, he should have been located quickly. Voice contact, a hand raised from cover, a shape under a tree. Instead, hours were dissolving into more hours, and he seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, just ahead of lines, just outside perimeters, always one ridge over from the place you were sure he'd be. The father's account of the headlights hovered like a splinter. Maybe it was stress. Maybe ice refracted a beam from far below. Maybe it was something else. Whatever it was, it stayed in the story, impossible to prove and hard to forget. By mid-afternoon of the second day, a scout team easing around a shoulder of rock saw something in a pocket of brush behind a large, mossy boulder, a shape tucked in, not fallen cleanly, not sprawled at the base of a cliff, but sheltered. They moved in and found James McCormick Jr. He was on the ridge, not far from areas already searched. His boots and socks were gone. A strip of bark had been pulled across part of his body like a crude blanket, the kind of thing a cold mind might attempt in final, instinctive defiance of the weather. There were no obvious signs of a long fall, no sign that he'd gone tumbling down the main face of the cliff. Just a boy who seemed to have crawled into a pocket and gone still. The radio call traveled down the mountain. Line slowed, then stopped. People turned and began the walk back through brush and rock with that quiet that follows when a question has an answer no one wanted. The coroner's conclusion was straightforward: death by exposure. That matched the belongings left behind, the physical signs and the timeline. The official paperwork didn't dwell on the oddities. The mountain had delivered a familiar verdict. Back at the lodge, gear clinked into plastic tubs. Radios were powered down. Firefighters who had hiked through 2 storms in 24 hours stood in small circles and spoke in low tones. The scouts sat on the tailgate of a truck and stared at the ground, wiped out in the way only a long, wet search can wipe you out. The father didn't speak much. He didn't have to. Everyone in that lot knew the shape of the moment. Still, as the first write-ups hit, the quieter details stuck with people who'd been on the line. The trail of clothing that didn't line up with warmth and survival. The timing that put hundreds of trained bodies within shouting distance for hours without a single call and response. The final position that sat unnervingly close to ground already covered. None of those details rewrote the cause. Together, they made the whole feel skewed, like you'd stared at a picture long enough to memorize it and still couldn't spot what was off. The story that reached the broader public was respectful and simple. A family went hunting. A sudden wind return pinned them in. A father walked out to get help. A massive search combed the mountain. A young man was found on a ridge and could not be saved. Funeral notices ran. Portland turned the page but did not forget. For people who plan and run searches, this case became a quiet reference point. It showed how fast a familiar hill can turn hostile when weather moves, how even strong teenagers can crash from cold quicker than anyone expects, and how a grid that looks perfect on a map still leaves pockets where a person can lie down a few yards off a line and vanish from view. It also carried that thread of the uncanny that seasoned rescuers rarely bring up first but never quite shake. A light where no road runs, a set of belongings that tells a story you don't want to believe, and a final location that feels like the mountain was holding its breath until the minute it wasn't. None of that changes the paperwork. All of it changes how you feel when you lace up in a December storm and step into dark timber after someone who hasn't come home. Larch Mountain still draws people up its trails. In winter, the ridge goes quiet under snow, and wind claps through the crowns of the firs. If you stand near Franklin Ridge and look into the timber, you see soft edges, boulders tufted with moss, branches stitched together, places where a person could lie down and be invisible from 10 feet away. But if you know the story, that slope carries a weight you feel in your shoulders. You remember a father staring at a tree line that did not give his son back. You remember headlamps moving like slow constellations in sleet. You remember a light in the woods that shouldn't have been there, and a boy who seemed always one ridge away until he wasn't.